Imagine a city, its walls, its streets, its houses, its markets, a place where thousands of people lived, laughed, worked. Then one day, that city ceases to exist. It's destroyed, it burns, or it's abandoned. And over centuries, earth piles up over it. Layer by layer, dust carried by the wind, rubble from collapsed walls, the foundations of new structures built on top of it. Until one day, that city is completely forgotten, becoming nothing more than a mound, an ordinary heap of earth. The 4 cities I'm going to tell you about today experienced exactly this fate. Their names appear in the Bible, their stories are told, but for centuries, many historians thought these were nothing more than legend, mere religious allegory. Then archaeologists started digging, and out of the ground came things no one expected: burned walls, broken pottery, destruction layers, and sometimes evidence that eerily lines up with the story the Bible tells. Today we're going to dig up 4 cities, not literally, but mentally, following decades of archaeologists' work. Some findings are definitive, undisputed. Others are still the subject of heated scientific debate. Telling the two apart is the most important job of this video. What surprised me most while preparing this research was this: one of these cities, until fairly recently, was considered by many serious historians to have probably never existed, dismissed as a purely religious invention, an exaggerated legend. But when archaeologists began digging into the earth, it turned out that the city not only existed, but was even bigger, even more impressive than the Bible described. We'll get to that story shortly, but for now, know this: sometimes the most unbelievable sounding accounts are the ones with the most solid evidence buried beneath the ground. Here, we don't run from the hard questions, we step into them. Let's begin. Archaeologists have a word they use to describe these kinds of buried cities: tell, or in its Arabic Hebrew pronunciation, tell. This refers to an artificial mound in the Near East, formed by thousands of years of settlement piling up on top of itself. Think about it. A city is founded, houses of mud, brick, and stone are built. Centuries later, that city is destroyed: an earthquake, a war, a fire. But people return to the same spot because the water source is still there, the trade route still passes through. They build their new homes on top of the old rubble. This cycle repeats, sometimes dozens of times, over thousands of years. The result? An artificial hill, a time capsule containing dozens of different settlement layers. When archaeologists dig into these mounds, they proceed almost like reading a book's pages backward. The topmost layer is the newest, the bottom layer the oldest. In each layer, they find traces of ash, broken pottery fragments, sometimes burned grain remains, sometimes human skeletons. These layers are dated using methods like carbon dating and pottery styling, but this dating process isn't always an exact science. Sometimes it's open to interpretation, sometimes to heated debate. Let me illustrate just how precise this method can be with an example. At some major mounds, such as Megiddo in the region of Palestine, more than 20 separate settlement layers have been identified, the lowest reaching back to the Chalcolithic period, around 4000 BC. A single excavation season usually lasts only a few months, and fully excavating a large mound can take decades, even a century, which is why most mounds excavated so far are still only partially dug, and there's always a chance new findings will emerge in the future. Now, keeping this method in mind, let's look at 4 cities, each a scene of a different story in the Bible, each hiding a different secret beneath the ground. I also want to note this: in choosing these 4 cities, I paid attention to variety, both geographically and in terms of the strength of evidence. 2 of them, Jericho and Hazor, are directly connected to Joshua's conquest narrative, with decades of excavation data resting on a solid academic foundation. 1. Sodom is still a contested, ongoing scientific puzzle. And the last, Nineveh, is perhaps the most striking example of all, because before it was discovered, this city was considered by many historians to be almost entirely fictional. Our first stop is a city that perhaps carries the claim of being the world's oldest continuously inhabited settlement: Jericho. Located in today's West Bank, just west of the Jordan River, below sea level, This city is buried in a large mound archaeologists call el-Sultan. You'll remember Jericho's story, the famous scene described in the book of Joshua, where the army of Israel walked silently before the Ark of the Covenant for 6 days, circled 7 times on the 7th day, and then the walls collapsed on their own. For centuries, this story was read as purely a religious narrative, perhaps a symbolic parable. But at the start of the 20th century, when archaeologists began digging into this mound, things got interesting. The first major excavations were conducted in the 1930s by British archaeologist John Garstang. Garstang found a double-walled fortification system surrounding the city, an inner and an outer wall, and determined that these walls had collapsed dramatically at one point, even falling outward. This matched the description in the book of Joshua strikingly well. The text describes the walls collapsing on their own, not through a normal siege tactic, but through a sudden collapse. Perhaps an earthquake had struck at that moment. Garstang dated this to the period when Joshua led Israel, roughly 1400 BC, and this discovery made major headlines at the time. But here's where things get complicated. In the 1950s, British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon re-excavated the mound using far more advanced stratification methods and reached a different conclusion. Kenyon's method was revolutionary for its time, known as the Wheeler-Kenyon method. This technique of excavating a mound in small, controlled square sections, documenting each layer separately, is still used as the standard archaeological practice worldwide today. Kenyon argued that previous excavators may have overlooked important stratigraphic details, and with her own meticulous method, she was able to date pottery fragment styles with far greater precision. According to Kenyon, the destruction layer Garstang had found was actually much older, around 1550 BC, roughly 150 years before Joshua's era. According to her dating, by the time Joshua arrived, Jericho had almost no settlement at all. The city was already in ruins. This sparked a heated debate that still continues in the archaeological world today. Some researchers accept Kenyon's dating and argue that the Joshua narrative is more a theological account than a historical event. Others suggest there may be errors in Kenyon's pottery dating method, or that the biblical chronology itself can be interpreted differently. Some theologians argue that the Exodus took place not in 1446 BC, but around 1200 BC, trying to match the dates with a different destruction layer entirely. Honestly, this debate remains unresolved to this day. There really is a dramatic collapse of the walls at Jericho's mound on this. Almost everyone agrees. But exactly when this collapse happened, and at whose hands, is still a question archaeologists haven't reached a definitive consensus on. An interesting historical note. Before Garstang and Kenyon, German archaeologists Ernst Sellen and Karl Watzinger had also excavated this mound, and they too had found a destruction layer, but since the dating methods of that era weren't as precise as today's, their findings had to be reassessed by later generations. This shows an interesting aspect of archaeology. The same piece of ground gets re-examined by scientists from different generations, each time with slightly more advanced methods, and sometimes previous generations' conclusions change entirely. This isn't a weakness of science, quite the opposite. It's proof of science's ability to continually correct itself. The mound itself is a place you can visit today, right at the edge of the city of Jericho. It's been turned into an archaeological park open to tourists. You can see the excavation layers, the remains of ancient walls, and even one of the world's known oldest stone towers, dating to the Neolithic period, roughly 8000 BC, thousands of years before the events described in the Bible. This tower, roughly 10 meters tall, containing a narrow internal staircase, was an extremely advanced structure for its time in terms of engineering. Some archaeologists believe it served a defensive purpose, others think it may have had a religious or ceremonial function. Whatever the case, it shows us, by the time Joshua's army stood before its walls, Jericho already had thousands of years of settlement history behind it. Our second stop is a city the Bible describes as the head of all these kingdoms, Hazor. Located in today's northern Israel, north of the Sea of Galilee, this mound was, in antiquity, one of the largest, most powerful city-states in the region, with an area of roughly 70,000 square meters and an estimated population of 20,000. It was almost a metropolis by the standards of its time. The book of Joshua specifically notes that Israel did not burn most cities during the conquest of Canaan, only plundered them, but Hazor was made an exception. The text plainly states, Joshua turned back and captured Hazor and put its king to the sword. He burned Hazor itself. This shows that even within the text itself, Hazor held a special status, emphasized as the region's leader. In the 1950s and 60s, Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin, both an academic and a former general in the Israel Defense Forces, carried out extensive excavations at this mound. And what he found was quite striking. In the city's late Bronze Age layer, roughly the 13th century BC, there was intense fire damage. Palaces, temples, houses, all covered in a thick layer of ash and soot. Some stones had been exposed to such high temperatures that they had cracked and shattered. Perhaps the most striking detail Yadin found was broken statues discovered in a Canaanite temple, specifically, a statue representing a Canaanite god, with its head and hands deliberately severed. This looks less like accidental war damage and more like a deliberate religious symbolic act of destruction, as if the conquerors wanted to symbolically defeat not just the city, but the gods it worshipped. This carries a striking parallel to the religious language the Bible uses when describing the conquest of Canaan, the command to tear down pagan altars and statues. Yadin's team also uncovered a massive palace complex beneath the city, likely belonging to an administrative building. Cuneiform tablets found inside show that Hazor held not just regional but international importance. One relates to diplomatic correspondence with the Kingdom of Mari in Mesopotamia, proving that Hazor was part of a broad trade and diplomatic network at the time. But again, we need to be honest. The exact date of this destruction layer, and who was responsible, remains a matter of debate. Some archaeologists directly link this destruction to Israel's conquest. Others suggest it may be part of a broader collapse wave that occurred across the region during the same period known as the Late Bronze Age collapse, a mysterious wave of destruction that affected many major civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean at the same time. Mycenae, the Hittites, and many other major civilizations collapsed similarly during this period, and the cause still isn't fully understood. Climate change, mysterious invading migrants known as the Sea Peoples, internal uprisings. There are many theories. So Hazor's burning is a definitive archaeological fact. But whether this fire was started by Joshua's army or by regional chaos still isn't known for certain. Accepting this uncertainty doesn't diminish the strength of the evidence. It simply reminds us of the limits of the certainty archaeology can offer. An additional note, Yadin himself was quite cautious when publishing his results. He wasn't a religious archaeologist, but he openly stated that the evidence he found aligned with the Joshua narrative, while also emphasizing that this wasn't definitive proof, only a consistent finding. This kind of scientific modesty is actually one of the hallmarks of reliable archaeology. One more interesting note. Hazor appears not only in Joshua's conquest narrative, but also, later, in a verse about Solomon's building projects. 1 Kings 9:15 notes that Solomon built Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. In Yadin's excavations, nearly identical six-chambered gate structures were found in all three cities, showing these three cities were genuinely built during the same period, likely by the same central government, according to a standard plan. This is an independent piece of archaeological evidence that strikingly aligns with what the Bible tells us about Solomon's building activities. Our third stop is perhaps the most controversial, most speculation-prone city on our list, Sodom. You'll remember the story told in Genesis 19, Sodom and Gomorrah, two cities destroyed by sulfur and fire from the sky because of their moral corruption. For centuries, Sodom's exact location remained a complete mystery. Some traditional theories suggested the city now lies beneath the waters of the Dead Sea. But in recent years, attention has turned to a different region, the Fertile Plain area where the Jordan River flows into the Dead Sea, described in the Bible as the Jordan Plain. Here, at a large mound called Tall el-Hammam, a team led by American archaeologist Stephen Collins has been conducting excavations since 2005. And this team's claims are genuinely striking. They found evidence suggesting a Middle Bronze Age settlement, roughly 1700 BC, was suddenly destroyed by an extremely intense, high-temperature event. Among the most striking of these findings is this. Researchers found, on the surface of pottery fragments, a glassy melt layer formed at temperatures no ordinary fire could reach by some estimates, exceeding 1,500 degrees Celsius. High concentrations of sulfur and melted metal particles were also detected. In 2021, a team of scientists, in an article published in Scientific Reports, proposed that these findings may have resulted from a cosmic airburst, an explosion, similar to the Tunguska event, caused by a meteor or comet breaking apart in the atmosphere. Now, I need to be honest here, because as exciting as this claim genuinely is, it hasn't been universally accepted within the scientific community. Some archaeologists question the claim that Tall el-Hammam is really Sodom, on the grounds that it doesn't fully match biblical geography. The Genesis text is generally read as placing Sodom south of the Dead Sea, whereas Tall el-Hammam is located to the northeast. Other researchers argue that while the destruction evidence found is real, it doesn't necessarily have to come from a celestial impact. It could also stem from an ordinary fire or an earthquake-related disaster. I want to add another dimension to this debate. After Collins's team's article was published, some geologists and planetary scientists wrote critiques, arguing that the cosmic airburst theory doesn't sufficiently meet evidentiary standards. According to them, the melted glass particles and high-temperature traces are real, but explaining them doesn't necessarily require a celestial object. This region, known for its oil and bitumen deposits, could have produced similar results through natural gas explosions or intense underground fires. This region is still geologically known for its tar pits. Even Genesis 14:10 specifically notes that the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits. So the cause might not have come from celestial objects, but directly from these flammable sources underground. Either theory can align with the description of a city destroyed by sulfur and fire. This teaches us an important lesson. An exciting finding doesn't automatically mean definitive proof. The Tall el-Hammam excavations are real, serious, academically published work, but the claim that this is definitely Sodom remains a debated, unproven hypothesis. I can't give you a definitive yes or no in this video, only that there's a genuinely hard-to-explain, interesting archaeological puzzle here. Even before Tall el-Hammam rose to prominence, there were dozens of different theories about Sodom's exact location. Some early 20th century archaeologists proposed the Bab ed-Dra and Numeira mounds south of the Dead Sea. This region also has Bronze Age settlements that were suddenly abandoned, and cemeteries where thousands were found buried. This theory is still supported by some researchers, and remains in academic competition with the Tall el-Hammam theory. At the heart of the geographic debate is this. Genesis 13:10 describes Lot looking towards Sodom and seeing that the whole plain of the Jordan, all the way to Zoar, was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This depiction implies the region was extremely fertile at the time, and it's a verse both camps interpret differently to back their own views. Tall el-Hammam supporters argue the northeastern region fits this description thanks to the Jordan River's irrigation potential. Southern theory supporters argue all the way to Zoar geographically points south. Our fourth and final stop is perhaps the city with the most striking discovery story on our list, Nineveh. The great Assyrian capital described in the book of Jonah, the city the prophet didn't want to go to, and where he eventually preached after emerging from the belly of the fish. Nineveh's story is interesting, because up until the 19th century, many Western historians considered this city's existence to be almost entirely legendary. Aside from a few references in the writings of the Greek historian Herodotus, there was no solid, contemporary evidence of Nineveh. Some academics thought that an entire Assyrian empire, a capital described as being a 3-day walk in size, could simply be an exaggerated invention of religious texts. This skepticism was so widespread that in 18th and early 19th century encyclopedias, Nineveh was often described as lost, or, according to some writers, probably never existed at all. Some travelers had seen the large earthen mounds near Mosul but hadn't realized these were man-made, that an entire imperial capital lay buried beneath them. To them, they simply looked like natural hills. This illustrates one of archaeology's most fundamental challenges. Sometimes, the greatest discoveries sit right in front of us, unnoticed, because no one thinks to look for anything there. Then, in the 1840s, everything changed. French diplomat Paul Émile Botta and British explorer Austin Henry Layard began excavations at two large mounds near today's city of Mosul in Iraq, mounds called Kuyunjik and Nebi Yunus. And what they found shocked Europe. Massive palaces, detailed relief carvings covering the walls, winged bull statues, enormous guardian figures called lamassu, and perhaps most important of all, King Ashurbanipal's immense library. Layard's excavation journals vividly reflect the excitement of that era. His team had to transport the massive stone statues they pulled from the ground, some exceeding 5 meters in size, kilometers away to the riverbank, then ship them by boat to London. Today, many of these artifacts are on display at the British Museum, seen by millions of visitors worldwide. This discovery created such a sensation that newspapers of the time practically declared Layard a hero, and his excavation reports became best-selling books. This library was one of the oldest, most comprehensive systematic libraries known in history. It contained more than 25,000 cuneiform clay tablets. Among these was the most complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, an epic whose own flood narrative carries striking parallels to the biblical story of Noah, and this discovery alone rewrote the history of ancient Near Eastern literature. This library's discovery was revolutionary not just in a literary sense, but a practical one as well. The tablets included astronomical records, medical prescriptions, dictionaries, legal documents, even letters written to kings. Ashurbanipal himself even had notes added to some tablets stating he had collected them specifically for his own library, making him one of history's known first book collector kings. Nineveh's size was also confirmed by the excavations. The city's walls really did stretch for kilometers, and population estimates, thought to have exceeded 100,000, point to a truly extraordinary size for that era. The phrase in the book of Jonah, "a great city, a 3-day walk across," isn't a precise scientific measurement, but can be read as a proportionate, non-exaggerated depiction of the city's real size. So how did Nineveh come to be buried, forgotten? In 612 BC, an alliance of Babylon, the Medes, and the Scythians besieged and destroyed Nineveh, a destruction so complete that the Assyrian Empire itself was wiped from history after this event. The city was never rebuilt, and over the centuries, earth covered it over. The book of the prophet Nahum foretells this destruction in an almost poetic tone. Nineveh is in ruins. Who will mourn for her? This detail is especially striking, because Nineveh's story appears in the Bible in two different ways. In the book of Jonah, the city repents and earns God's mercy. But in later generations, in the book of Nahum, the same city faces a definitive prophecy of destruction because the repentance was temporary and the city returned to its old habits. Archaeological excavations confirm that this second, definitive destruction truly took place. I want to add one more note about the book of Jonah itself. This book has a somewhat different structure compared to other prophetic books. While most prophetic books contain messages delivered directly to the people, Jonah is written almost entirely as a narrative. This literary difference has led some interpreters to read the book more as an instructive parable than a historical record. But an important point: this debate is entirely separate from the question of whether Nineveh itself really existed. Regardless of the genre of the book of Jonah, the city itself is a reality definitively confirmed by archaeological excavations. While telling you about these 4 cities, there's one more thing I need to be honest about. The internet is full of sensational archaeology claims that prove the Bible, and most of them lack serious scientific rigor. Over the years, various people have come forward with claims like, "I found Noah's Ark," "I found the exact spot where the Red Sea parted," "I found the ashes of Sodom." The vast majority of these were never published in peer-reviewed academic journals, were never verified by independent archaeologists, and were usually put forward by documentary producers or amateur researchers, often for commercial purposes. There's a common pattern to these kinds of claims, and it's worth recognizing. They're usually presented as a hidden, suppressed, or ignored by the official scientific community discovery, using language as if there's some deep-rooted conspiracy hiding the truth from the public. But real archaeology works in exactly the opposite way. A serious finding, no matter how striking, needs to go through peer review, be retested by other researchers, and go through a verification process that takes years. This process is slow, sometimes tedious, but this slowness is the source of science's reliability, not its weakness. It's important to see the difference between the four cities I've discussed. The excavations at Jericho and Hazor are decades-long, serious scientific work, published in peer-reviewed journals, supported by respected universities worldwide. Nineveh's discovery is an undisputed archaeological reality confirmed for nearly 2 centuries. The tall el-Hammam, Sodom theory, meanwhile, is a hypothesis based on real excavation data, but still debated somewhere between probably and definitely. One more example, because this pattern is common enough to recognize. Images that occasionally circulate with headlines like "Pharaoh's army chariot wheels found at the bottom of the Red Sea" turn out, upon examination, to usually be either coral formations or entirely fabricated, digitally created images. These images aren't tied to any real excavation report, any real coordinate, any real researcher's name. They simply circulate as shareable visuals. Real archaeology, however boring it may seem, is always tied to a name, a date, a publication, an institution. When we consider these 4 cities together, we notice an interesting pattern. Each was, at one point, a center of power, of pride, sometimes even of cruelty. Jericho was a fortress that boasted of impassable walls. Hazor was a power center referred to as the head of all these kingdoms. Sodom was a city known for its wealth and moral decline. Nineveh was a massive imperial capital, a 3-day walk across, and every single one of them, sooner or later, was buried beneath the ground. Think about it this way too. None of these cities could have imagined being destroyed. Jericho's residents felt completely safe behind those thick, double-layered walls. Hazor's kings saw all the other kingdoms of the region bowing before them, believing their power would never be shaken. Nineveh's people believed that magnificent city would last forever as the capital of the world's greatest empire. And yet, all of them met their end beneath the ground. What does this teach us? Perhaps the simplest lesson is this: no power built by human hands, no walls, no empire, is permanent. As the writer of Ecclesiastes put it, everything is meaningless, fleeting as a breath. These 4 cities' mounds are, in a way, the physical, tangible proof of this truth. Once loud, crowded, proud streets, now silent layers of earth. But at the same time, these mounds also give us hope, because those who dug them up brought forgotten stories back into the light. Nineveh, dismissed as just a legend for centuries, was proven to be a real city. Jericho's walls, controversial as they may be, carry the traces of a real destruction. This reminds us, the truth, even buried beneath the ground, doesn't completely disappear. Dug up patiently, carefully, it can one day resurface. There's one more connection between these 4 stories worth dwelling on. Each, in some way, contains an unexpected turn. At Jericho, the unexpected thing was that the walls collapsed almost on their own. At Hazor, the unexpected thing was that the region's most powerful city, with its entire army, couldn't prevent its own destruction. At Sodom, the unexpected thing was that a fertile land, like a garden of paradise, turned to ash overnight. At Nineveh, the unexpected thing was that the city first repented and was saved, then years later returned to its old habits and this time was truly destroyed. In every story, the outcome is the exact opposite of human expectation, and perhaps this is a shared theme across the Bible's city narratives. Visible power or security is never the deciding factor. For archaeologists, digging up these mounds usually takes decades, sometimes an entire lifetime. Kathleen Kenyon spent years of her life at Jericho. Yiga el-Yadin showed similar dedication at Hazor. Layard worked for years under difficult conditions to discover Nineveh. None of them expected a great discovery on the first strike of the pickaxe. Patience was their most fundamental tool. Perhaps this is a valid lesson for uncovering the buried truths in our own lives too. Some things don't come to light in a day, with a single decision. They come to light layer by layer, patiently, over the years. Today we toured 4 cities. Jericho's controversial but real walls. Hazor's burned palaces and broken statues. Sodom's mysterious ashes that still await a resolution. Nineveh's massive ruins, long thought to be legend and then proven real. Each offers us a different level of certainty, some almost undisputed, others still the subject of heated scientific debate. But all of them together show us the same thing. The world the Bible describes isn't a purely abstract, purely legendary world. These people really lived. These cities really existed. And beneath the ground, the traces of their stories still remain, reminding us of a truth that knows how to wait patiently. Perhaps after watching this video, the next time you hear the name Jericho, Hazor, Sodom, or Nineveh, you'll no longer imagine them as distant, abstract stories, but as places where real people once lived, with real walls, real streets. And perhaps this will stay with you as you read the rest of the Bible too. What's described in these pages didn't happen in some purely abstract spiritual world, but in real geography, in real time, among real people. If this video made you think, write Mound in the comments, and don't forget to mention which city's story affected you the most. On this channel, every week, we step into the most mysterious, least discussed passages of the Bible, because we believe the truth, however deeply buried it may be, is always worth searching for. Let me know in the comments which lost city, which buried truth, you want us to dig up together next time. See you in the next video.